Welcome back in. I'm Collette Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camarata. Steve is the author of Late Talking Children, A Symptom or a Stage. This book, congratulations, now in its second edition. Today's topic from the book is Special Education Services, the Law versus the Practice. Federal law requires that special education services be delivered in the least restrictive environment. What does that mean?
So one of the challenges in serving children and supporting them is that it's really crucial that they be in the classroom placement that best meets their learning needs. However, there's really a pressure to separate them from other children. Now, in some cases where there's high learning needs or could be medical needs and so on, it's really difficult for that child to be in the regular classroom. Or sometimes we see children that have such strong behavior challenges that because they're hurting other children, they really can't be in there. But most of the time, the best place for a child to be taught is in the regular classroom with their peers. And so the federal law supports that notion. So least restrictive environment means that the child is in the regular classroom or a mix of regular classroom and special education classrooms that is optimal for their learning needs. And so they have a right to be with other children, basically, is what it says.
What does a segregated classroom look like?
So basically the idea is, so let's take a child, for example, that has cerebral palsy, and they have a high support need in terms of being moved around and things like that. And also maybe let's say that they are learning more slowly than their children. Because of the challenges that they're having, it may be that we have to have a special classroom with trained people to support their needs, to be able to take care of them and so on, that can't really be met in the regular classroom. So that special classroom is considered a segregated classroom. Another example is that some children with a hearing loss where they can't use a cochlear implant or the hearing aids aren't that effective, they may need to be taught in sign language. And so in a regular classroom, sign language isn't there. So you might have a special classroom or even a special school for deaf children. So segregated has kind of a negative connotation because of racism and things like that were horrific. It's not really meant to be that. What it means is that the child's support needs are such that they really can't be met in a regular classroom.
So how hard is it to move from a segregated classroom and be reintegrated into a regular classroom?
So that can be really challenging, and there's lots of reasons for it. So let's say the child support needs long term are such that it's really going to be difficult for them to ever be in a regular classroom. Then, it's fine. It's a good placement. On the other hand, you may have a situation where your late talker has high needs initially, and then you really want to kind of, over time, get them into the regular classroom. Now, my only talking son initially was in a segregated preschool for language impaired children. Mostly those aren't around as much as they used to be, but there was a speech pathologist who was the teacher. She was amazing, and it was a great placement for him. On the other hand, because they initially misunderstood his learning challenges, they actually initially recommended that he be in a separate classroom for children with intellectual disability. Because he didn't have intellectual disability, that would have been a bad placement. On average, though, once a child goes into a completely segregated environment where there's not a specific plan to reintegrate them, they never really get back into the regular school, even if they could down the line. And so that's a challenge we want to be thinking about and being aware of.
You've said before that almost all late talking children can and should be in integrated classroom with their peers. And so why is it? Why are you pushed for that?
Yeah, so we have a lot of studies and data that are going on now for several decades that show that when a child is around typically developing peers, there's a lot of incidental benefits, not only in terms of their achievement and learning, but also in terms of social skills, routines, being integrated in the community. And so there's a lot of direct and indirect benefits to that. And part of my work, too, is I do work a lot with Down syndrome. Children with Down syndrome, they have different learning needs, and we have to kind of adopt a homeroom kind of part of the time in special learning, part of the time in regular education. But people with Down syndrome, it's amazing that this, even though they have different learning needs, that being around their typically learning peers is super beneficial. And the example one of my colleagues uses is that historically, people in Down syndrome in society were segregated. They were actually put in institutions. And if you watch videos of that, by the way, it's really heart-wrenching. Many of the adults are in diapers. Many of them can barely talk. And now you see people with Down syndrome that are reading and are have friends and are connected socially. And the only difference there is really the expectations and the opportunities for that child to learn. And so we learn our lesson the hard way in some sense. So even when a child has learning differences, we really want them to be in the regular classroom as much as possible. And that's why least restrictive environment is written into the federal law. We know that's beneficial.
And sometimes a child might be integrated into a regular classroom for just part of the day. So how do you feel about that?
So the challenge is that late talking children for whom the late talking is a symptom, they have higher learning needs often. And so it's really difficult sometimes for a teacher who has to manage a lot of different children. There's a lot of pressure on teachers. They're doing the best they can, but it can be really hard for them to individualize for the child in the way actually that's supposed to happen. And again, that's not a negative thing on teachers. It's just the reality of it. So what can happen is you can say, okay, we know the law is that they have to be in the regular classroom, but we're going to put them in for recess. We might put them in for music, which, by the way, I think music's great as long as it's not too much talking at the kids. It's more music-oriented. It's beneficial. But they're not really integrated in it for substantive subjects like math and reading and so on. And if the late talking child can learn those things, then they really need to be in the regular classroom for those subjects too. It shouldn't be that they're only in for PE and other things like that. There really needs to be a good faith effort to meet them and their learning needs in the regular classroom, not only for social reasons, but also for academic reasons. And they need academic subjects.
You've worked with some families where the school mapped out goals and a plan, and the students just ended up in PE with the regular class.
Right.
So
that does happen.
Right. How do you help them navigate to make sure that it's a challenge for parents sometimes.
It is a challenge, and so the first thing is, like in the IEP and Individualized Education Plan meeting, it's important to lay that out. And that actually is a contract between the parents and the school, and they'll say, okay, they call it inclusion. We're going to do inclusion, and then you say, okay, great, I like that. Can you specify how much time is inclusion and under what circumstances and what subjects? Okay. That way, you're having them tell you, oh, we're going to integrate them for PE, but not for math and reading and science. And you're going to go, well, actually, let's go ahead and put in the contract that they're going to be in for these other subjects. So you just want to kind of get the details of what the school is planning for your late talking child.
An IEP, is it good for each school year? How often do you have to go in and change that, modify it?
So the IEP plan is actually valid for 3 years.
3 years.
So
okay.
The process is that the child goes through an assessment, and then they're made eligible, or they determine eligibility for services, and then you have a meeting that verifies the eligibility, and then also looks at where the services are going to be delivered, the placement, the classroom, the circumstances, and then the actual learning objectives that are accommodations for that child under special education law. And so that's in place for 3 years, but the parents have the right to update that. So in other words, after a year, if they met their goals, maybe we want to modify the goals, but the actual eligibility and plan are in place for a 3-year period.
How can parents make sure that the services they agreed upon are actually being provided?
So that's accountability, and the parents need to be in regular communication with their teachers. And again, the schools always mean well. Sometimes there can be personnel shortages. We have had cases where a child is, say, eligible for speech pathology services or special education tutoring, but because there's personnel shortages, they're not delivered. When the parents learn that's happening, they need to immediately call an IEP meeting and say, hey, we need these services. I do try to help parents understand that schools' resources are stretched and so on, but their child does have a right to those services. And so it's a matter of being in regular communication with the lead teacher, whether it's a regular education teacher or a special education teacher. Just keep in close contact. And then, to be honest with you, the support people should be regularly providing notes and updates every week or every 2 weeks. There should be notes so that the parents can see that the services are being delivered.
How many times a week should a young child, a late talker, or anything related to a speech delay, how many times a week should they be receiving treatments or services?
So the treatments and services are supposed to meet their educational needs as agreed on by the team. Now, the reality is that there's programs. And so, like, for example, for speech pathology, if you just go into the regular process of the IEP, normally they're going to get 1 or 2 times a week for 30 minutes, which, unless the child has relatively low support needs, really isn't going to be enough. And so if you want to do something other than the default level of services, then that's a part of the negotiations during that meeting where you say, my child has a severe speech disorder. We need to have additional support. Maybe even like for some late talking children who have severe speech disorder, they may need an augmentative device, a computer device to help them speak. And that has to be negotiated. And doing 30 minutes a week won't be enough to support that. So the meeting not only has the placement of where they're going to be taught, it actually gives you the amount of time for each of these services. And there's going to be kind of a generic or default level that happens. If that meets your child's needs, great, and it may. A lot of times the process works great. But when it doesn't work great, then you have to be prepared to try to maybe get additional services for your child.
What kind of goals should you set for your child with the school district, with the person that's giving them the treatments or the therapies?
So the schools really are the experts on learning, and so it's always good to kind of see what they're going to suggest and to listen to that and, to try to take that to heart. On the other hand, sometimes generic goals are generated by an eligibility label. So for example, let's say a child's made eligible for autism. They may have these kind of generic social goals. Children with autism really have this variable profile, and so those set of goals may or may not meet their needs. And so you want to be prepared to go in and actually work with the school and say, my child already meets those goals. I will tell you, though, that in my experience, when my late talking son was getting his IEP when he was in preschool services, the school recommended a set of goals, and my wife, Mary, and I had enough expertise. We knew which ones he could and couldn't do. And so we pointed that out, and they weren't necessarily on board with that initially. And then after they got to know Vincent a little bit better, then they realized that we really did know his level and they were willing to accommodate it. So I didn't want to ram the goals down their throat initially because I did trust that they were good and that they would learn. But on the other hand, parents can sometimes be met with skepticism when they're suggesting goals. And to be sure, sometimes parents are asking for things that their child's not ready to learn. And so it should be a collaborative process. On the other hand, if there's a set of goals that don't meet their child, or there might be a set of goals that are not evidence-based. So, for example, they might say, the child needs to be more organized, and more sensory organized. And what does that really mean in some ways? So you want to make sure the goals are written in a way, and this is also the law, that they're measurable and accountable. But they also should be reasonable for that child. I also have had schools suggest goals that are really kind of tangential to the child's learning needs. And so, for example, they might say they have to answer, 10 yes/no questions on demand. That's not really a high priority for any late talker, and it's actually something that you could do pretty quickly. It wouldn't take that much support. So, again, you want to work with the schools. But you also want to make sure the goals actually are meeting the child where they are developmentally, and that they're also, reasonable and aligned with what your hopes and expectations are for them academically.
And goals, if you have a late talker, the goal should be related to the speech delay, right?
Absolutely. So that's a great point. So even when I have a little disagreement with exactly what the school's working on or the speech path's working on, if they're working on talking and understanding and a late talker, I'm really happy. Because, again, there may be some little nuances, but really if they're working in that area, and actually with my son Vincent, they were working on talking things. That's why I didn't push it in that meeting. And I did. I trusted that they would figure it out. They did. But if they're saying something like, I'm going to work on auditory integration, or I'm going to work on tactile stimulation, or things like that, I mean, we want to work on talking, Your child's there because it's a late talker, and those kind of things aren't really related to their performance. And so that can be a challenge too, where a school might have a generic package that includes some of those elements that aren't evidence-based and don't meet their child's needs. So you just want to be really careful about that and be vigilant. It could work well, but if it doesn't, you need to be able to step in.
And you can have more than one goal, right? You can prioritize them, right? Your main goal and then subsequent goals after that.
Yeah, so in other words, that's how an IEP works. So you have these main academic goals. Normally it's going to be organized where there's learning goals, or maybe social goals, or maybe language goals, and each of those areas will have a big picture goal, and then they'll have steps on how to get there, and that all should hang together and be logical. And again, parents may not have that knowledge, and so they may want to read and get some background, but coming in, most parents will have a sense of if, oh gosh, that is something I think my child needs to learn versus, I'm not sure, why are you working on that? And they certainly can ask that question and they should get an answer for that.
What kind of guidance do you have for parents so that they're making sure that the teaching and support services are targeting those goals and going for them?
Yeah, so I think this actually is in a larger conversation about what schools are teaching and kind of what you're hoping your late talker will learn, but it also is true for non-late talking children. So basically, when we're thinking about teaching someone in school, we're thinking about the long-term knowledge and skills that person has. And so walking into it, I want every late talker to be able to read and understand what they read. I want them to be able to do at least basic math and maybe even a little bit more complex math. I want them to know about science. I want them to know about history. And all those things should be thought of in the IEP goal. In other words, it should be, you may be dealing with a preschooler and you're going to focus on understanding because auditory understanding, auditory comprehension, because we know that's important for later reading, and understanding narratives and stories and so on. So all these goals should align with building an adult child and the, thinking not only about today and what the narrow near goals are, but thinking about, okay, why is my child learning this and how is this going to align with what they have to do in grade school and middle school and high school? And that should be content driven. In other words, we should be thinking about, I want this late talker to learn about quantity, basically have knowledge of greater and less than and being able to count and think about basic math concepts. I can't really get it into their brain verbally because they don't understand often because they're late talkers with maybe a receptive language problem. So I'm going to use visual supports for that. But my goal is for them to have that knowledge in the preschool area. And so you're thinking about just building this child's brain and their learning, and you have to be very attentive to this content knowledge. That's crucial. So all the goals, whenever someone has a goal, you just say, okay, how is this teaching them math? How is it teaching them reading? How is it going to align with what their learning is down the line? How is it helping them to be able to essentially be a well-educated middle schooler, high schooler, and beyond? And so you always want to be thinking about that. And there are steps for it. They're developmental, but everything should align with that, and they should be able to answer that.
And if a parent doesn't feel as though the school district is meeting their child's needs, they have rights, right? There are federal laws that protect them.
Yeah, there's federal and state laws. And so let's say, for example, there's a disagreement about where the child's placed or what the goals are, what their eligibility is. You can have due process. You can go actually to a legal hearing. I'll be honest with you, I don't like to do that because I really want everybody working together. And again, usually I do. Sure. But sometimes, for example, one case I was involved in where the child was put in a separate classroom for an intellectual disability. My testing showed that they really could learn more quickly than the school thought they could. It was really important that I get them, because of the least restrictive environment, that I get them into that, and that had to go to due process. I'm happy to say that we won the case, but it causes a lot of acrimony. It's expensive, and I really rather not do that if I don't have to. But anyway, the parents do have rights, and the first right is to say, I'm really worried about the goals, or I'm really worried about what's happening in the classroom. You can ask for one of these IEP meetings, and then the teachers and the principal and the support people, special educators, speech paths can all get together, and you can then talk to them about what adjustments you want to make. And so you do have that as an option. And there is a legal process as well, but again, I think you need to access it, but I do that only as a last resort.
Do you have any final words of encouragement for parents going through this right now?
Yeah, so all late talkers can learn, even the ones that have more severe challenges, so we always want to think about that. There's many, many wonderful teachers, speech paths, special educators who are very dedicated, very smart. So we just want to have these caveats and these kinds of processes in our back pocket in case something goes wrong, so we can then help our child. The other thing is that because your child's vulnerable, it's really important that you feel empowered to be their spokesperson. You really want to feel empowered to, in a sense, protect them, because if something unfortunate is happening, then they're not necessarily in a position to express that themselves because they have challenges. And so I know it's hard sometimes to stand up to the schools. You're going to hear all these experts and stuff. And again, mostly it's going to be okay, but when it's not, you do have to kind of stand up for yourself and for your child's rights. And that's really important, that you know how to do that and you're ready to do it if it's needed.
Thank you, Steve. In our next podcast, we're going to walk parents through some of the challenges while navigating the school system. So please tune in for that right here next week. In the meantime, please feel free to ask us a question. Just drop it in the comments section below. Click subscribe so you don't miss a thing, and hit that bell. And you can always check out the Late Talkers Foundation website.
And always remember, best thing for your child is you.